Iran fired on Indian ships while Iran's own foreign minister had promised the world, just 24 hours earlier, that every commercial vessel would pass through safely. Not weeks before, not months before. 24 hours before Iranian gunboats opened fire on unarmed tankers, carrying Indian crews in international waters. And what India did next is the part of this story that almost nobody is covering correctly, because most people stopped paying attention the moment the diplomats started talking. I'm going to change that today, because what actually happened underneath the diplomatic language is one of the most tactically and strategically interesting moves any country has made in this entire war. Here's what I'm going to walk you through today, in order, so you know exactly where we're going. First, I'm going to break down the Strait of Hormuz. Not the geography lesson version you've heard 100 times, but the operational reality of what the waterway actually means for anyone trying to move through it under threat. Then I'm going to walk through exactly what happened on April 18th, what the IRGC gunboats actually did, and why that specific tactic matters beyond the headline. After that, I'm going to show you what India's response really looked like. Not the summoned ambassador version the news covered, but the operational picture underneath it that tells a completely different story. Then I want to put India's move next to the historical context of non-alignment, because without that backdrop, you cannot fully understand how significant this shift actually was. And finally, I'll give you my honest bottom line. Not a hedge, not a we'll have to wait and see, but a direct read on what this episode actually reveals about where this war is heading and who is quietly being pulled into it. This is going to take some time to do properly, so if you are new here, subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to cover. Let's get into it. I want to start with the Strait of Hormuz, but I want to start with it the right way. Not as a geography lesson, but as a threat environment. When you're planning any kind of operation in a contested corridor, the first thing you assess is the choke point geometry. How wide is the usable lane? What are the flanking positions? And where does the threat most likely come from? The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point gives large vessels barely enough room to pass each other in opposite directions, with defined inbound and outbound shipping lanes that everyone in the region knows by heart. That predictability is exactly what makes it dangerous, because any adversary with fast, small surface assets and knowledge of those lanes doesn't need to be everywhere. They just need to be at the right point at the right moment. The IRGC Navy has spent decades optimizing for exactly that environment. Their doctrine isn't built around large surface combatants trying to slug it out with a carrier strike group. That's a fight they would lose, and they know it. Their doctrine is built around swarm tactics, fast inshore attack craft, and the ability to appear, threaten, and disappear along a coastline they know better than anyone else operating in those waters. And what that means operationally is that the threat in the Strait of Hormuz is not a conventional naval engagement. It's a harassment and coercion campaign designed to make passage expensive, unpredictable, and psychologically exhausting for commercial operators. Now layer on top of that the economic reality, because this is where the strait stops being a military problem and becomes a global pressure point. A significant share of the world's seaborne oil moves through that narrow gap every single day. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and yes, Iran itself all use that same corridor. For India specifically, this isn't a distant geopolitical variable. It is the physical pipeline that keeps the country's economy running. And any disruption in that waterway shows up directly in Indian fuel prices, Indian factories, and Indian homes within days. That's the operational and economic context you need to carry into everything that follows. Because without it, the April 18th attack looks like an isolated incident, and it absolutely was not. India had been watching this threat develop for weeks before the attack, and watching it with a level of seriousness that most outside coverage completely missed. New Delhi had quietly established a dedicated maritime monitoring center specifically to track Indian-flagged vessels moving through the Persian Gulf region, staffed around the clock, built specifically for this threat, operational before the April 18th incident ever happened. That detail matters because it tells you India's government understood perfectly well that its ships were operating in a high-risk environment and had already made a deliberate institutional decision to treat that risk as a national security problem, requiring a national security response. That monitoring center was not a public announcement, not a press release, not a diplomatic signal. It was a quiet operational capability stood up by a government that was taking the threat seriously while saying very little about it publicly. Now let's talk about what actually happened on April 18th, because the headline version leaves out the details that matter most if you want to understand the full picture. 2 tankers flying the Indian flag were transiting near Larak Island inside the Strait of Hormuz. Completely routine, completely legal passage of the kind those ships make on a regular basis without incident. IRGC gunboats intercepted both vessels and opened fire, forcing both tankers to abort their planned routes and turn back the way they had come. One of those tankers was carrying close to 2 million barrels of oil, Not a symbolic target, not an abstract shipping statistic, but a real vessel with real crew members carrying a cargo that represents genuine national economic interest for India. I want you to sit with the timing for a second, because this is the detail that defines the entire episode. Iran's foreign minister had gone on the record publicly and clearly the day before this attack, stating that the Strait of Hormuz would remain fully open to commercial traffic for the duration of the ceasefire period. Not conditionally open, not open with exceptions for specific flag states, not open pending further review, fully open. That was the stated position of Iran's own chief diplomat, made publicly, on the record, to the world. 24 hours later, IRGC gunboats were firing on Indian-flagged ships in that exact same waterway. From a credibility standpoint, and I want to be direct about this, what happened on April 18th wasn't just an attack on two tankers. It was a demonstration that Iran's word, issued at the highest diplomatic level, has a shelf life measured in hours rather than days, when operational decisions on the water conflict with diplomatic statements made in meeting rooms. That is a significant data point, and every country that has any kind of shipping interest in that region, not just India, logged that data point and drew their own conclusions from it. The attack itself caused no fatalities and no serious structural damage to either vessel, which matters and should be stated clearly. But the absence of casualties does not reduce the strategic significance of what the gunfire communicated. Now here is where I want to go deeper than what you'll find in most coverage of this story, because most reporting stopped at the summoned ambassador and called it a diplomatic protest. That framing misses the actual story, which is what India had already quietly put in motion weeks before the April 18th attack ever happened. India launched Operation Sankalp, the name translates roughly to resolve or determination, and deployed a naval contingent specifically to escort and protect Indian commercial vessels transiting through the Gulf region. This was not announced with a press conference, not publicized through diplomatic channels, not coordinated with any external coalition or combined command structure. It was India building and deploying an independent protective capability on its own terms and under its own authority. Let me put that in operational terms, because I think the significance gets lost when it's described in purely diplomatic language. India positioned multiple warships in the Gulf of Oman, just outside the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, maintaining constant communication with Indian merchant vessels and providing escort coverage as those ships exited the most dangerous stretch of the transit. At the peak of the crisis, the number of Indian warships in that operating area grew from 3 vessels to as many as 6 or 7, organized into 2 dedicated naval task forces with a specific mission: keep Indian-flagged ships and Indian crews alive and moving. That is not a symbolic flag-showing exercise. That is a sustained, scaled, operationally serious commitment of naval assets to an active threat environment, run entirely by India's own military chain of command. Here's the tactical detail that I think is the most telling part of this entire operation, and it's one I haven't seen get nearly the attention it deserves. None of the Indian warships ever entered the Strait of Hormuz itself. They held position in the Gulf of Oman, outside the strait's mouth, and from there they coordinated protection for vessels that had already made it through the most dangerous section. That positioning was not a limitation. It was a deliberate choice, and it reflects exactly the kind of careful operational thinking that India applied to this entire situation from start to finish. Staying outside the strait meant India could provide genuine, substantive protection for its ships without putting Indian naval vessels into direct confrontation range with IRGC assets inside the strait itself. From a mission planning perspective, that's a genuinely sophisticated line to hold. You are close enough to matter. If something goes wrong at the strait's exit, you can respond. You can communicate, you can coordinate emergency action, but you're not inside the contested corridor in a way that creates a direct military confrontation with Iran's naval forces. It threads the needle between doing nothing, which was not an option once Indian crews were at risk, and doing too much, which would have created a direct military flashpoint India had no interest in creating. That kind of precise operational calibration doesn't happen by accident. It reflects a government and a military that thought this through very carefully before they moved to single ship. Now, I want to give you the context that makes all of this genuinely remarkable, because without understanding India's historical posture on these questions, the significance of what happened here doesn't fully land. India's foreign policy since independence has been built around one foundational principle above almost everything else: non-alignment. This is not a minor diplomatic preference or a background instinct. It is the organizing philosophy that has shaped nearly every major decision India has made on the international stage for more than 70 years. During the Cold War, when almost every country on Earth felt enormous pressure to formally align with either the United States or the Soviet Union, India helped found an entire international movement specifically dedicated to staying outside both camps. That same instinct has carried forward into how India manages its relationships with Washington, Moscow, and Beijing simultaneously. maintaining working relationships with all three in a way that would be impossible if India had formally committed to any one of their strategic frameworks. And it has shaped how India has approached this Iran conflict from the very beginning, watching carefully, protecting its interests quietly, and avoiding any public statement that could be read as formal alignment with either side. India's Ministry of External Affairs confirmed during this period that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz had not even been formally discussed with the United States in any direct bilateral setting. An Indian government spokesperson stated clearly that India's long-standing policy is to participate in international military operations only under a United Nations mandate, not by joining any single country's coalition. At one point during the conflict, the President of the United States publicly called on countries around the world to contribute warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. India's response to that request was silence, not a formal refusal, not a diplomatic note explaining its position, just silence. And in the world of international diplomacy, that kind of silence is its own complete answer. It is the non-aligned playbook executed exactly as designed, allowing the absence of a response to carry the message without creating any formal headline that might damage the relationship with Washington. That is the India that existed on one side of this conflict. Careful, quiet, determined to stay out of someone else's war, regardless of what the most powerful country on earth was publicly asking for. Which makes what India was doing on the other side of that public silence genuinely extraordinary. At the exact same moment India was ignoring a direct request from Washington to join a coalition naval effort, it was quietly deploying its own independent naval task force to the same waterway that coalition was meant to protect. At the exact same moment India's foreign ministry was saying publicly that non-alignment remains its foundational policy, Indian warships were positioning themselves in the Gulf of Oman and maintaining around-the-clock escort coverage for Indian commercial vessels. That gap between the public posture and the operational reality is the whole story. And it represents something genuinely new for a country that has spent 70 years treating military deployment near active conflict zones as the kind of step it simply does not take. Let me give you one more piece of context that makes India's eventual diplomatic response even more significant than the headline made it sound. Back in early March, weeks before the April 18th attack, India allowed an Iranian warship, the Iris Alvin, to dock at the port of Kochi on India's southern coast. India's foreign minister called it a humanitarian gesture. The vessel had developed serious technical problems and needed a safe port to make repairs. And India, consistent with its self-image as a country that approaches international situations from a place of basic human decency, agreed to provide that port. Here is the detail that makes this almost impossible to fully process. This happened on the same day that an American submarine sank a sister ship of that exact vessel off the coast of Sri Lanka. Sit with that for a second. On the same day the United States military was sinking one Iranian warship, India was quietly sheltering another Iranian warship in one of its own ports on humanitarian grounds. Both ships had actually been in India just days earlier for an international naval event that New Delhi itself had hosted. They were heading home when the war broke out, and one of them found itself in immediate need of emergency repairs. India received the docking request on the very day the war began and said yes, a decision that carried real, obvious potential cost to India's relationship with Washington, a cost India's government accepted because it had concluded it was the right thing to do. That is the level of demonstrated goodwill India had extended toward Iran before the April 18th attack. Not vague diplomatic neutrality, not careful public statements about staying out of other people's conflicts, actual concrete action, sheltering an Iranian naval vessel at real diplomatic risk at the precise moment that vessel's sister ship was being sunk by India's most important strategic partner. If any country on earth had genuinely earned the benefit of the doubt from Iran through demonstrated real-world goodwill rather than empty words, it was India. And even that goodwill, that extraordinary, tangible, costly goodwill, was not enough to keep Iran's gunboats from firing on Indian ships in international waters the moment operational calculations on the water overrode whatever the foreign minister had said in a press statement the day before. Now let me give you my read on what India's response actually communicated. Not the diplomatic translation version, but the strategic signal version. Summoning an ambassador is a formal, deliberate, highly visible act in the world of international relations. It is not a quiet phone call. It is not a note sent through normal channels. It is a government publicly and formally saying, we know exactly what you did. We are registering it at the highest level, and we are not going to pretend it didn't happen. India's foreign secretary called that meeting and used the phrase, deep concern about the firing on civilian vessels. And in diplomatic language, deep concern is a carefully chosen phrase that professionals select, because every word used in a moment like that carries consequences beyond how it sounds on the surface. The statement placed responsibility for the danger squarely on Iran's actions, without India ever needing to say so in blunt terms. It communicated everything it needed to communicate through register and tone and the formal weight of the meeting itself, rather than through accusatory language. But the ambassador summons was only the visible layer of India's response. The operational layer underneath it is what actually tells you where India's government had drawn its line. When Iran's gunboats fired on Indian ships, India did not respond with military force, did not send warships into the strait to confront the IRGC patrol boats responsible for the attack, did not issue any statement that could be characterized as a threat or an ultimatum. What India did was continue and expand the operational commitment it had already quietly put in motion. More ships, more coverage, more sustained presence in the Gulf of Oman, 2 dedicated task forces where there had previously been a single patrol deployment. That scaling of the independent naval operation, happening at the same time as the formal diplomatic protest, is the complete picture of India's response. And together they communicate something very precise. They communicate that India is willing to protect its own people and its own economic interests with real military capability, deployed on its own terms, answering to no one else's command structure. They communicate that India is willing to formally and publicly rebuke Iran's actions when those actions directly threaten Indian lives and Indian ships, even after months of extraordinary goodwill and deliberate neutrality. And they communicate simultaneously that India is still not joining anyone's coalition, still not formally labeling Iran an enemy state, still not taking any action that could be characterized as military confrontation with Iranian forces. That is a genuinely narrow position to hold under this kind of sustained pressure, and the fact that India has managed to hold it while executing a real, scaled, operationally serious naval protection mission is one of the more impressive strategic balancing acts of this entire conflict. I want to compare India's approach directly to what the European nations did in the same waterway during the same period, because that comparison makes India's chosen path much clearer. France, Italy, and Greece were all operating naval protection missions in the broader Gulf area during the same window. Coordinated, multinational, openly aligned with a Western security framework built over decades of shared alliance structures. A French diplomat confirmed publicly that Paris was actively working with partner nations on a joint naval effort specifically aimed at securing the strait for international shipping. Exactly the kind of formal coalition posture that India was simultaneously and deliberately avoiding. That is the European approach. Lean into existing alliance structures, coordinate with partners, operate under shared command, and make the commitment public as part of its deterrent value. India chose the opposite of every single one of those decisions. Independent capability, no coalition coordination, its own command structure, and maximum operational discretion combined with minimum public profile. The European approach bets that collective commitment and visible alliance solidarity deters aggression and builds long-term security architecture. India's approach bets that precise, calibrated, self-reliant action protects its immediate interests without creating the political commitments and relationship costs that come with formal alliance participation. Neither approach is obviously right or obviously wrong. They reflect genuinely different philosophies about how a country protects itself in a world where the major powers are in conflict with each other. But the contrast is worth sitting with because it illustrates exactly how different the strategic calculus looks depending on your history, your relationships, and what you're actually trying to protect. For Europe, the strait is a shared problem requiring a shared solution, and the alliance framework exists precisely for moments like this one. For India, the strait is an Indian problem requiring an Indian solution, and the whole point is to handle it without acquiring the strategic obligations that come with joining someone else's framework. Now let me bring the human dimension into this, because I think it's easy to lose sight of when the conversation stays at the level of warships and task forces and diplomatic summons. India has one of the largest populations of professional merchant sailors anywhere on Earth. Tens of thousands of Indian citizens working on commercial vessels that transit exactly this kind of high-risk waterway as a routine part of their jobs. Every Indian-flagged tanker moving through the Strait of Hormuz during this conflict had real people on board, often dozens of Indian crew members doing a job that had suddenly become far more dangerous than anything they had signed on for. Each one of those sailors is somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's husband, people whose families back in India were watching the news and trying to figure out whether their loved one's ship was one of the ones that had been fired on. India's government-run maritime monitoring centers were reportedly fielding thousands of calls and messages from anxious families during the worst periods of this crisis. That is not an abstraction. That is the real human weight that sits underneath every decision about naval deployments and diplomatic meetings and operational positioning in the Gulf of Oman. When India's foreign secretary used the phrase, "a deep concern over the firing on civilian vessels," there were thousands of Indian families for whom that phrase was not diplomatic language. It was a direct description of the fear they had been living with every day. Their relative's ship was in that waterway. The April 18th attack forced every one of those families to spend an entire day not knowing whether the people they loved had made it through safely. And that human reality is a significant part of why India's government responded the way it did, with a combination of formal diplomatic protest and expanded operational protection that goes beyond what pure geopolitical calculation alone would have required. I also want to acknowledge something that I think deserves to be said clearly and directly. The uncertainty that ordinary sailors have had to carry through this entire conflict is extraordinary, never fully knowing whether the stretch of water they are about to transit has actually been secured, whether promises made by any government involved in this conflict will actually hold up once their specific ship is the one testing them on the open water. Iran's foreign minister promised full safe passage. 24 hours later, Iranian gunboats were firing on ships in that same water. For a sailor on a commercial tanker running that strait, that gap between diplomatic assurance and operational reality is not an abstract geopolitical problem. It is the personal reality of their workday, and it rarely receives the acknowledgement it deserves. Let me flag something I want to be clear about before I give you the bottom line, because I think intellectual honesty requires it. Some of the operational details around Operation Sankalp, the exact number of vessels at specific points in the timeline, the precise coordination protocols between the naval task forces and commercial shipping. These details come from sources that range from confirmed official statements to reporting that should be treated as credible but not fully verified. What is confirmed? India deployed a naval contingent to the Gulf of Oman. The operation was real and sustained. It grew in size as the crisis intensified, and it operated independently of any multinational coalition. What I'd take with a degree of caution: the specific vessel counts at any given moment and some of the details around internal Indian government deliberations that come from unnamed sources. Those are credible enough to include in this analysis, but you should know they carry the caveat that unattributed sourcing always carries. I flag that not to undermine the story, but because I think you deserve to know exactly how solid the ground is under each part of what I'm telling you. The core of this story, India's independent naval deployment, the April 18th attack, the summoned ambassador, the Iris Alvin docking, those are confirmed and solid. The granular operational details sit on slightly softer ground, and I'd rather tell you that directly than let you walk away thinking every number in this video carries the same level of confirmation. That's the honest read, and I think it matters. So here is my bottom line. Direct, no hedging, just my professional read on what this episode actually means. India never fired a single shot at Iran during this conflict. It never formally joined the American coalition. It never publicly labeled Iran an enemy state. By every traditional measure of what it looks like when a country enters a war, India stayed on the sidelines. But India deployed 6 or 7 warships to an active conflict zone, built 2 independent naval task forces, conducted a sustained escort and protection mission for its commercial fleet over an extended period, and issued one of the sharpest formal diplomatic protests of the entire war, all while maintaining the public language and posture of strict non-alignment. That gap between the public posture and the operational reality is not a contradiction. It is a strategy, and it is a strategy that India has executed with more precision and more discipline than almost any other country pulled into this conflict's orbit. What the April 18th attack revealed is the limit of that strategy under direct pressure. India could maintain quiet operational protection and public diplomatic neutrality as long as the threat remained ambient and general. The moment Iranian gunboats fired on Indian ships with Indian crews in international waters, the calculus changed, not because India abandoned its principles, but because its principles include a clear line about the safety of its own citizens that no amount of non-alignment doctrine excuses crossing. That line, the protection of Indian lives and Indian economic interests, turned out to be the point where 70 years of careful neutrality met something it simply could not stay quiet through. And the response India chose when it crossed that line tells you a great deal about how it intends to navigate every hard choice this conflict forces on it going forward. The broader lesson buried in this story is worth naming explicitly. This war, whatever you think about its origins, its justification, its likely outcome, has forced dozens of countries with absolutely nothing to do with the original dispute to make genuine, high-stakes decisions about their own security and their own economic survival. India is one of the clearest examples of that dynamic, but it is far from the only one. And the choices these third-party countries make under this kind of pressure will shape the post-war international landscape in ways that the headline coverage almost never addresses. Watching how India threaded this needle, protecting real interests with real capability while maintaining the language and posture of formal non-alignment, is genuinely useful for understanding not just this conflict, but the broader question of how major non-Western powers intend to navigate a world where the great powers are in direct military confrontation. Whether India's balancing act can survive if this war drags on for months or years more, whether there comes a moment where staying this careful becomes genuinely impossible, is honestly one of the most compelling open questions inside this entire conflict. No one, including officials inside India's own government, could answer that with full confidence right now, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What we do know is that a country that sheltered an enemy warship's crew out of basic humanity, that stayed silent when a superpower asked for its help, and that bent over backward for months to avoid taking sides, that country still drew a real formal line the moment its own people were put in direct danger. That tells you something much larger than a story about ships and diplomats and gunboats in a narrow strait. It tells you that neutrality has real limits, that even the most disciplined long-term policy eventually meets a moment it cannot stay quiet through, and that the countries navigating those moments most carefully are often the ones you hear the least about in the daily headlines. Drop your honest read in the comments. Where do you think India's line actually is? And how much further does this conflict have to escalate before India can no longer hold the position it's currently holding? I read every comment, and on a story this layered, I genuinely want to hear from people who have perspective on India's foreign policy, its maritime industry, or its relationships in the Gulf region that the outside coverage never captures. If this gave you a side of this conflict you hadn't seen before, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories like this one coming about the countries quietly being pulled into this war's orbit while the world's attention stays locked on the loudest voices in the room. I'll see you in the next one.